we have never seen anything like this before in American history, where we've got thousands of federal law enforcement officers deployed to cities in the interior to round up almost indiscriminately hundreds or thousands of people. And I think it's really crucial for people to understand that some of the explicit targets in Minneapolis were people here lawfully. One of the main things that federal agents were in Minneapolis to do was this thing called Operation Paris, Parris, which was about arresting and detaining lawfully present refugees, people who had been vetted and screened years ago and came to the United States legally on pathways to green cards and eventual citizenship, and then detaining those people, sending them to Texas to be interrogated about their status. And then oftentimes when the interrogation resulted in federal officials realizing the person had done nothing wrong and in fact was a lawful refugee, just dumping the person on the streets of Texas and telling them, you find your way back to Minnesota. So we have really, a recipe for clashes between communities and federal law enforcement officers when this kind of thing is happening, because of how unprecedented it is, and because it really shocks people's conscience to see their neighbors rounded up, arrested without warrants, thrown into vans, and spirited off to the airport 90 minutes later to be flown out of the state. And that's exactly what's happening and what led to these clashes and unrest, which have ultimately resulted in the killings of Renee Good and Alex Preddy.
I want to ask you, because I think that this is, maybe a year ago, people would have thought you're being dramatic if somebody said this. But, when you step back and look at these patterns that we're witnessing, you see mass raids, the repression of protest, detentions of U.S. citizens, of course, in addition to many non-U.S. citizens, the use of lethal force in the streets. Does ICE still function as what you could call a conventional immigration agency, or is it increasingly being used as a political instrument to target communities and movements that maybe don't fit Trump's ideological agenda? You see people, and I do this sometimes too, throwing around terms like, this is Trump's militia. And I'm just curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I would say yes and no. I mean, no, in that, yes, in that ICE is still carrying out nationwide a lot of the kinds of stuff that it has done for many years. And I think it's crucial to understand, as whenever the focus is on the media is just on a singular city like Minneapolis, ICE is still in every city around the country, and people are still being arrested and detained around the country in immigration courts in ways that the Trump administration has, started up in June of last year. And they have new officers coming on board every week now as part of the mass hiring binge that are engaged in some of the more traditional kinds of ICE tasks, like going to local jails and picking people up that have been turned over by local police and then taking them to detention for processing. All of that continues on as normal. But what is new is the way in which the administration is deploying not just ICE, but DHS forces in general, including the Border Patrol, Customs and Border Protection officers, and a bunch of officers from around the federal government as part of these large surges to very clearly blue cities with governments that oppose the president's policy priorities. And I think you look at exactly what Trump described the Minnesota operation as: retribution. And you see the ways in which, yes, the federal government is being used to carry out these punishments. But at the same time, it's not like they are there with doing nothing under federal law. There are the machine continues operating even when it isn't being used in this very targeted, retribution focused way.
Well, it's really interesting, Aaron, because, today there's been news coming out that, in fact, the sort of switch up between Tom Homan and Greg Bovino may result in also the withdrawal of some ICE and CBP officers from Minnesota, which the Democrats seem to be hailing as a victory. They seem to be caving on some of their demands from the Republicans. No surprise there, trying to avoid a government shutdown. But I think really the sentiment on the streets, it would seem, and amongst communities, is that is not really justice at all. And so I'm just wondering, If you can talk a little bit about what is accountability and what does justice look like in the aftermath and in the midst of this massive operation that's happening, again, as you mentioned, not only in this moment of Metro Surge in Minneapolis and Minnesota, but nationally. And, what tools, legal, congressional, or grassroots, are being used, could be used to actually restrain and dismantle this kind of enforcement apparatus?
Yeah, well, I think number one ask for justice and accountability is formal investigations into the officers who killed Alex Preddy and Renee Good. They cannot sweep this under the table as they've attempted to do. It took 4 days for them to even say that they were putting the officers who killed Alex Preddy on administrative leave. And there's still no evidence that the officer who killed Renee Good was ever put on administrative leave. In fact, was allowed to leave the state and go back to his normal duties within just a couple of days after it had happened. Same situation would happen with Marimar Martinez in Chicago. So we need real investigations into these situations where people are being shot, not just political, whitewashing going on by the administration. But beyond that, we really do have to talk about actual ways to rein in the agency. And a big one will be eventually cutting the funding that ICE got in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. That law provided ICE with $75 billion, $45 billion to be used for immigration detention. To give you some sense of how much money that is, averaging it with ICE's normal budget, it's about $15 billion a year for the next 4 years. The entire Federal Bureau of Prisons budget is less than $9 billion. So we're talking nearly twice the budget of the entire federal prison system that ICE is going to have over the next 4 years. And they also got $30 billion for hiring and other enforcement operations. All of that money can and should be clawed back because we do not need a system that is that massive. We also need to have better external accountability, ensuring that members of Congress actually are able to exercise their right to go into detention centers and demand accountability and see, what's going on there. And we also need the restoration of and bigger teeth for the internal government watchdogs that have been gutted by this administration. And then finally, I want to talk about changes to the legal justice system and courts, because many people don't know it's extremely difficult to sue federal law enforcement officers and hold them accountable. You cannot just sue cops the way you can sue a state and local law enforcement officer if they are federal officers. And so we need real accountability for federal law enforcement officers who violate civil rights and the ability of federal judges to step in and make meaningful orders to restrain unlawful immigration enforcement operations.
Aaron, something that you often bring up is something that gets, I think, drowned out by all of the Customs and Border Patrol and ICE violence that we're seeing in the streets, and that is the conditions that immigrants are facing who have been detained. That are just the reports of increasingly horrific abuses and conditions. So I'm curious if you can kind of give us an update of what we know has been going on in immigration detention over the last few months.
So we just put out a big new report 2 weeks ago on the expansion of immigration detention in Trump's first term that you can check out on our website, AmericanImmigrationCouncil.org. And what we document is that the ICE detention system, fueled with this new wash of cash from Congress, has expanded more than 80% since Trump took office, from 40,000 people in detention on any given day at the start of his term to now more than 73,000 people in detention as of a week or two ago. And that detention expansion has been so quick that the system has become overwhelmed. The conditions were always bad in ICE detention. There's always been abuses, same as there are in the entire, carceral system. But those abuses are getting worse because they are rushing people into the system faster than they can hire up officers to staff it and make sure there's enough medical care or even ensure that people have beds to sleep in. We've had appalling situations where people have been arrested so fast that they're held in holding cells at local ICE field offices for days at a time, sleeping on concrete floors, not getting enough food, not being provided access to medical care. And the end result is deadly. ICE 30 people died in ICE custody in 2025, and 6 people have already died in custody in 2026. Of those, 3 of those were people who died because of medical issues. Several of their families say that those issues were longstanding chronic conditions that were not properly addressed, leading to people having, medical crises. 2 of those were suicides. And that's a sign that the system is not protecting people. And one of them was the first ever homicide of someone held in ICE detention. This was at a tent camp, slapdash, ramshackle tent camp built in El Paso on a military base where they're already holding more than 3,000 people, the largest ICE detention center in history, and where 3 people have already died since it started up in August. That is a sign of the system fully breaking down.
I mean, it's horrifying what you described, and it's definitely necessary to keep our eyes on both of those elements. And just before we let you go, Aaron, you are a trove of this information, and I really encourage people to check out those reports online. But as you said, there's things going on multiple fronts. We have the deployment of ICE and CBP to the cities. We have these horrific conditions in these detention camps, and at the same time, people's legal status is being undermined. And so programs that have existed for decades, TPS, are being ended dramatically. Communities that have enjoyed some sort of regular status are now essentially becoming targets. We know that Trump has threatened the Haitian community in Ohio. Could you talk a little bit about these attacks on TPS and what it means?
Yeah, and I think the big picture there that people really should process is that in Trump's first year, he stripped legal status from more people than he deported. So more people were rendered vulnerable to deportation and undocumented than were actually deported. And so arguably the undocumented population may have gone up last year because of that, although the term undocumented has a lot of different meanings, and some people would say people with TPS were undocumented. So setting that aside, the key picture here is more people were rendered vulnerable. And as of February 4th, 350,000 Haitians are at risk of losing their temporary protected status unless a federal court steps in. That is a shocking moment because these are people who have been here for, at this point, anywhere from 3 to 5 or even to 10 or 15 years. There's 50,000 of those people who've been here since the earthquake in 2010 who have had temporary protected status, have been checking in with the government every 18 months for the last 15 years. And now they might be, tossed out on the streets and told, we're going to come and round you up. But all of that also goes along with cuts to legal immigration. We've seen the Trump administration impose the strictest and harshest nationality-based restrictions on immigration in the modern era since the 1924 racist national origin quota systems. 39 countries now cannot get immigrant visas to the United States, plus the Palestinian Authority. And nationals of those countries who are in the United States right now, who are applying for benefits since mid-December, have been unable to get their benefits adjudicated. So now you have this horrifying situation where you have people essentially potentially falling into limbo or losing their status because the government refuses to adjudicate their application. All of that is adding more chaos to the system and really making the United States even more immigrant unfriendly. And I think is undermining immigrant communities around the country.
Well, Aaron Reichlin-Melnick, it's always a pleasure to have you on. You are such a wealth of information on all of this. Please keep doing the amazing work you're doing, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you for having me.
大家好，我是主播周玉琴。很多的朋友告诉我们，选择原版的太阳星全效克菲尔益生菌，它添加有羽衣甘蓝，健康再加分。而有睡眠困扰的朋友们，赶快选择蓝色包装这一款晚安加强版，绝对是更有感。每日克菲尔，时刻美好 ，Good Feel Good， 请上快点购为健康下单，而且要记得输入推荐代码，有额外的折扣优惠。太阳星全效克菲尔益生菌基础版、晚安加强版，新包装改版，内容不变，抽取更方便。要吃就吃最好的。